Hi folks, Paul Padda here on the Paul Padda podcast, coming to you on July 10th, 2019, on a beautiful hot day in Las Vegas from Red Chimp Studios with a very special guest today, J. Malcolm DeVoy, or as I know you, Jay DeVoy.
Yes.
A rising superstar in the legal community. Jay is a great lawyer, and in interest of full disclosure, I've actually even hired you to represent me on some things. So and I can just say that you've done a great job.
Thank you.
And I appreciate you coming on today's show.
Thank you for the invite. It's exciting to be here. I've gotten to know you well. I can't talk about the other things we've done together, but I've seen how much you really care about your clients and you care about your work, and it's been very inspiring to see that level of determination.
I appreciate that.
Thank you to be on. I'm glad I can tell the public about my impressions
and
of you
hopefully
as well.
I've not been too much of a high maintenance client. No. Very easy to work with, right?
Can't tell those stories either, but no, it's a pleasure. Here, we can just do that.
There you go.
Thank you. Okay.
Well, today's a show where I think we could probably talk for like 3 hours straight, because we're going to talk about some things that, and this is part of your legal specialty, First Amendment, defamation type law, things involving free speech. I mean, that touches so many aspects of life today. I don't know anybody that doesn't use social media in this day and age. Mm-hmm. People have really strong opinions about a lot of things, and we're going to delve into all of those. But I think for my viewers, I know they're going to want to know a little bit about you. Why don't you just give us a nutshell version of who are you, where are you from, what brought you to Vegas, and what do you love about this city?
It's a very long story. I'm originally from Buffalo, New York. I really love the lack of snow. Mm-hmm. I could live without the 120-degree days, but we've had a very nice summer so far.
This is kind of like our winter, right? I mean,
very close.
In the equivalent sense that you just don't want to go outside all the time.
Well, it's similar, but you can still do a lot. You can go to Mount Charleston, it's always 20 to 30 degrees cooler, and I'm pretty sure if I went there right now, there would still be snow up on Cathedral Rock and Griffith Peak and some of those other trails. Mm-hmm. So that's exciting. I've really enjoyed living here. I moved here about 9 years ago. I came out here for my first job out of law school. I graduated in 2010, which other people might remember as being a very difficult time for the city. And I've really enjoyed moving here and seeing how it grows every single year. I remember for many years, what is now downtown Summerlin and really thriving was just a steel shell of what is one Summerlin at this point, and the office building they have there, and it's been exciting to see that come along, see the Smith Center, and just see a lot of young people who otherwise would have left stay in the city and really give back to it and contribute, and people such as yourself with backgrounds where you could have gone anywhere and you chose to come here and stay here and build something, and it's been exciting to see that, and it's really been an essential part of having the city grow and becoming something that it's still going to retain its character. It's still going to be very dominated by tourism, but
I agree with you. One of the things I've always felt about Vegas is it's a very welcoming city. I know you've had your own practice. Now you're with a much larger law firm, Holland and Hart.
Yes.
And prior to that, you were in private practice for yourself. You had a very successful firm on your own. But in cities like New York and LA, it would be very hard for people like us to do that, where you could just come in from outside, not have deep ties to this community necessarily through family and friends. We didn't go to the right high schools here. Mm-hmm. But yet you can still be successful. This is a town which I feel is almost like the quintessential American city that if you work hard enough and you're willing to put in the time, you can be successful. Whereas in other towns, sometimes the barriers to entry, do you know the right people? Do you have the right connections? Can your father, get you the clients, that kind of thing? There's always an element of that here too, but not so much as it is in other places, and that's kind of what I like about Vegas a lot. What do you think?
I agree with you. I think the benefit of if you were fortunate enough to go to a place like Bishop Gorman High School, it's undeniable, but I don't think I faced any kind of discrimination or prejudice coming here. I mean, it would have been helpful if I knew people through high school, and I think that the people who have done that, not everyone, it's not like there's some secret club that everyone's a part of and you're out of, but I think the people who have good social skills and are smart and they were able to keep in touch with people and be kind to them and treat them right, they've done extremely well, but you don't necessarily get that ticket just by being born here.
True.
To your point, I completely agree. Before I came to Las Vegas many, many years ago, I looked at jobs in other cities, and I would be in a place like Minneapolis, St. Paul, or Chicago, and I'd be asked about which high school I went to. Mm-hmm. And I said, St. Francis High School. And they just look at me and like, well, it's in Apple Springs, New York. It's right on Lake Erie. Obviously, it's not here. So there is that it persists in other cities. And it's just the issue of scale. Places like New York and Los Angeles, it's so large and it's so competitive. Yeah. It's nigh well impossible to do what you've done and start this firm and have about 20 employees.
I couldn't do it anywhere else. No. This is just a great town.
It's very unique in that way. I feel like the things that you can do here in the span of 5 to 10 years would take decades to accomplish anywhere else.
That's true.
Yeah.
All right, now I know you represent a lot of doctors. You have a significant part of your practice is healthcare law, but setting that aside, I know you have a niche practice in First Amendment, defamation, free speech type law. You work for a premier firm that handled those types of cases.
Yes.
So now we're going to get into the really good stuff. I want to ask you, this is, I know, on a lot of people's minds. I have clients who call in, or I have people who call in who are not clients but who want me to represent them. And those are the people I send your way, by the way.
I appreciate
you
it.
then later reject. But what does a person do when they see something about themselves on Facebook that's not true? Or let's say you're a restaurant owner and you're getting targeted on Yelp by a competitor who's maybe just manufacturing bad reviews and saying negative things about you. It's really frustrating, I think, to a lot of people. And for those of us, even myself as a lawyer, I've seen reviews about my law firm that are not true, and I know they're not true. And I don't know who's posted them, whether it's somebody who's a competitor or a disgruntled person who I said, look, I don't think you have a case. And people nowadays, it seems, are so unhinged that everybody feels they're entitled to their opinion, and they're entitled to make sure their opinion gets heard by the entire world on a review site. What can people do about that?
I think that's two separate tracks. With your indulgence, I'd like to treat them separately, dealing with individuals and dealing with companies. But before we even get to that point, it's this interesting cultural shift in this moment that we're living in, where 15 years ago, the internet wasn't real life.
Yeah.
And what happened on the internet didn't have consequences. It was just random stuff that had been posted. And I think everyone, in some ways, had a more sane attitude about it. Not that these words don't have consequences.
The good old days.
Yeah, well, we can always play that game and look back with nostalgia for what was just behind us. It's how Stranger Things became such a big show. But at the same time, it's this weird thing now where the internet is treated equivalent to real life, and in some ways it is, but people don't seem to understand that they're words on a screen. I understand getting mad about it when it's especially about you, but people getting mad about topics and what I like to call the federalization of everything. There's no more local issues. It's you're concerned about some nationwide issue, and there's a lot of emotional energy that goes into it.
Oh my gosh.
And it's this weird cultural shift that drives what you're talking about, where if you see something online, be upset about it, especially if it's false, and you can take corrective action. But the unhinged emotional response in both directions has been really strange, and it's a cultural trend that I hope reverses. But talking about individuals, because I know that's what people really want to focus on, if something's written about you, and if it's false, there's the question of, is it false or is it a statement of opinion? And then sometimes the two get mixed together.
Yeah.
A false statement is if I accuse you of a crime. I said, you've been arrested for murder. Obviously you haven't. But if I say, I don't think Paul Padda's a nice guy. Well, what does that mean? Obviously you don't like to hear that, and you'd like people to like you, but that's a statement of opinion, and the Supreme Court has repeatedly held there's nothing you can do about that.
Right.
You can be upset about it, you can ask for it to be taken down, but is it really going to harm you? You can't impinge on someone else's right to speak freely and limit their ability to say their honest opinion of you if it's exactly that, a statement of opinion. Now, there's this kind of in-between area where you can have mixed statements of fact and opinion, where you say some things that are true, and you also insert an opinion about it. In that case, you have to go to a jury to figure it out, and the court's not going to try to untangle it. Judges will look at it and say, okay, I'm not getting involved with this, you guys go figure it out. But the other thing that's becoming more of an issue is when you make true statements in a series, like you draw comparisons to somebody and they say, well, so-and-so has all these prominent friends, like Paul Padda has prominent friends, and he rides in a high circle, so did Bernie Madoff. And then you draw this conclusion and invites this unfair comparison.
Insinuation, essentially, is what you're saying.
Basically, I think that's a good way to look at it. I could delve into the legal terms, but I don't want to bore everyone too much with that.
But is that actionable? Can someone sue over that?
It can be. Nevada law is not as clear about that. Other states have recognized it as what's called defamation by implication. You make true statements that imply a false fact. So you can make these true comparisons. Like if I went side by side and I compared you to like Michael Avenatti, and not that I would do that. I'm not trying to disparage you in doing that.
I have more hair, by the way, actually.
That too. Probably taller as well. And, if you were to do something like that, the comparison would involve is, okay, well, Avenatti's been indicted in 2 separate states for a bunch of things he did to his clients. Can I really trust Paul? And people do that, and it's an unfair tactic, and it's a very close call, and it's something that I think right now is unresolved by the Nevada courts. Other courts have looked at it within the last 10 to 20 years, which sounds like a very long time, but in judicial terms, that's very fast. I mean, it literally happens in your lifetime, but 10 years goes in a blink of an eye when you're doing this long enough. And Florida has come down in that direction and expressly recognized defamation by implication. Idaho recently did as well. The Supreme Court has recognized it, and it's a creature of state law, but the Supreme Court has recognized its validity. If there was really a First Amendment issue with it that preempted state law, they would have addressed it previously. And the leading case on that before the U.S. Supreme Court is Milkovich versus Lorraine Journal. And I know we're just going very far down the rabbit hole. But it's something that Nevada doesn't have clear law on, but there is plenty of precedent that people can rely upon to say, if you're making all these true statements in a way that leads to a false conclusion about me that is harmful to me, that is something that could be actionable. And then that brings me to the point of a lot of these claims are missing the harm. People are upset about it, but who saw it? You're going to draw more attention to it. And that's a separate story about high-profile cases of people.
That's actually good advice.
I
mean, I think part of the problem is in this day and age, every human being is sensitive to things being said about them. And in the past, you could write a letter to the New York Times. I have some opinions about Jay DeVoy, and a lawyer in Las Vegas, but they were going to look at it and say, "Well, this could be defamatory." They wouldn't publish it. Now it seems like everybody is a journalist, right? You can have a blog, you can have a social media page, you can sit there in your pajamas at 10 o'clock at night and write stuff about people. And people, obviously, now it seems like social media is a giant bullhorn to the entire world in this way. But we also, I think, as a society, people are just starting to have to get tougher skinned, right? I mean, that's what you're saying, is that just because you can sue doesn't mean you necessarily should sue.
No, and we'll talk about that later, the consequences of potentially suing somebody. But yeah, I mean, there's certain.
Well, let's talk about it now.
Okay, sure.
Tell us.
Anti-slap. In many cases, it's not. And in full disclosure,
but first of all, just so my the viewers understand, what does anti-slap mean? It's not a law that means don't slap me, right?
Yeah, no.
Okay.
Nothing to do with actual physical slapping. There's other laws for that, but the anti-slap law, SLAP is a cute acronym for SLAPP, Strategic Lawsuit Against Public Participation. These laws started to percolate up in the early 1990s. Nevada and California actually got theirs at about the same time, but they took very different paths for many years. Since the beginning, California was about any form of public participation. It was basically broadened by the decisions of the courts that applied it to more and more public areas of interest. Nevada's was limited to speech before the government, which was also covered by California, but Nevada lacked, until very recently, the component that allowed it to be applied to any matter of public interest.
So in a nutshell, are you saying anti-SLAPP is basically a statutory defense? If someone sues me for exercising my First Amendment rights subject to specified limitations under statute, I can shut down your lawsuit, right, and get like attorney's fees and some kind of penalty for that.
Yeah, theoretically, it's a special motion. Normally, as you know, and as hopefully your clients don't have to experience firsthand, but likely are aware of, there's a long process of litigation. You go through what's known as discovery. You have to exchange records and things like that. The anti-SLAPP statute short circuits that in cases where the First Amendment and public participation is implicated. Within 60 days of being served with the lawsuit, you can go to the court with your evidence and say, this is retaliation against me for exercising my free speech rights. And the primacy of the First Amendment is such that the Nevada law is written in a way that, as you point out, if the anti-SLAPP motion is granted, you basically have to prove right away that you can win your case. So it's a very high burden. The Supreme Court really doesn't like them.
I don't like them either, I can tell you that.
Nobody likes them.
Well, because here's the thing, you're basically taking away the right of a jury to make that decision, right? That's my problem with it, is that you have now judges who sit there and say, well, I think this meets a threshold or this doesn't. Would you agree that it essentially nullifies defamation law?
I wouldn't say it nullifies it. I mean, to some degree, obviously, the anti-SLAPP statute has that issue. It really depends on the specific statute. They're creatures of state law. So the one in Nevada might be influenced by the ones in California or Washington. But what is going to be constitutional under the laws of that state varies. Like, I don't know offhand what the language of the Washington state constitution is and how that would necessarily apply to the decision that came out a couple of years ago where it struck down a more recent version of its anti-SLAPP statute. Some version of the Washington anti-SLAPP statute still remains, but the very robust version that people have been relying on, that went to the wayside, and for exactly the reason you state. The Washington Supreme Court said that this interferes with your right to a trial by jury. That being said, the reason for that is it went farther than the summary judgment standard. So what would happen there in that situation is, if you had a higher standard that let the court decide right away that we don't get to go forward with it, that was the problem. But where you use a standard where you produce evidence that would have ended the lawsuit anyway, that seems to be okay.
All right, so let's say a person goes on their Facebook page and says something about President Trump. I think President Trump is a crook. I think President Trump is a thief, or he's this or that. that person, let's say, gets sued by President Trump for defamation. Would this be an example of where the anti-SLAPP kicks in and says, oh, this is sort of, person expressing their opinions or about a public figure, someone who's, really attacking him in his capacity as president? Would that be an example of where the anti-SLAPP would come in?
Absolutely. That's a quintessential example. It's political speech against somebody who is a public figure. And for public figures, there's a higher standard. They have to prove that the allegedly defamatory statement was not just false, but the person who was speaking knew it was false or had a reckless disregard for the truth.
Okay.
And the reckless disregard for the truth is a very high standard. It's something where the truth has to be staring you in the face and you ignored it. Now, where this gets a bit more interesting is something that might be interesting to your viewers is the head of your HOA a public figure? Is your boss at work a public figure? Are they a limited purpose public figure where for the purpose of what you're speaking about, they're subject to a higher standard? So for something like the president, it's a very obvious call that they're a public figure and the anti-SLAPP statute would apply. For something that's a more localized dispute that's relevant to their lives but doesn't have national consequences, that's a bit tougher of a call. And
what's the legal landscape in Nevada? So it seems like California is on the more robust side of the anti-SLAPP statute. I know a lot of our laws are based on California laws. Washington State has found parts of their law to be unconstitutional. You say that the Nevada Supreme Court, even though the laws on the books has historically seemed to show some hostility to the anti-SLAPP statute. Maybe it's just a function of the cases that are coming before them. Where is Nevada sort of in that spectrum?
I think the Nevada statute as written is very broad and it's very protective of individuals. I think to the extent that the Nevada Supreme Court has expressed a hesitancy to grant these motions, it has to do with the specific cases. They've granted them. They granted them in a case involving a school district. They had another one involving a journalist that was actually sent over to them by another court because it involved Nevada law. And the other court on the East Coast said, we don't want to touch it. We don't know what's going on here. Nevada Supreme Court, handle it for us. And they affirmed the anti-SLAPP motion in that case. But for other recent cases, I think it has to do with the cases that are coming forward. And just like we were discussing, the difficult factual questions that are coming up and making the courts hesitant to say, we shouldn't even let a jury see this. This is something that we can take care of on our own.
Okay. All right. Well, that's actually really interesting. So this is a segment of the show where we go into Paul Padda for the People. I throw out a little tip. And I'm going to do that right now. Paul Padda for the People. Please, folks, pay attention. Here's some legal tips for you. Hi, folks. Paul Padda for the People with another helpful tip. If you've been involved in a car accident or you've been injured as a result of some type of incident, it's extremely important that you go to a doctor immediately, regardless of whether you think you're seriously injured or not. Very important to make sure you document what's occurring at the time it's occurring so that if you do bring a claim later, we have good documentation to be able to make a strong, forceful case for you. Always, always, always document your injuries and your experiences and what's going on by going to a doctor immediately after any type of personal injury event. This is Paul Padda for the People with another helpful tip. Well, welcome back, Jay.
Thank you.
Thank you for coming on our podcast. We're having a really interesting discussion. We've talked a little bit about anti-SLAPP, defamation.
Very technical discussion.
Technical discussion. No, but it's good to know the law because I think it's important. It gives people a backdrop as to why things exist the way they do. I mean, so what I'm understanding you to say in a nutshell, with respect to a lot of the issues on some of the social media accounts, if people feel they're being defamed, you just got to have thicker skin, right? It's probably not worth suing unless you lose your job or it affects your life significantly.
Yeah, if you can't show monetary damages, if you can't show you lost your job, you lost income or something like that, and even then it can be difficult to prove. If you are on thin ice at work and this is the last straw, it's going to be difficult. It obviously caused you harm, but if you know that you have a personnel file that's full of reports and write-ups and this was just the last thing on the camel's back that broke it, it's going to be a difficult case.
Right.
That being said, I have represented plaintiffs in the past. It's worked out well for them.
Okay.
But I'm very selective about those. It has to be something where I have somebody comes to me with enough facts that I can get through to the case and keep it to trial without doing anything more.
So I'm seeing a question. What about damage to reputation, even if you win?
Well, the money is supposed to undo that. The issue, as you pointed out about the First Amendment, is the court can't just tell somebody, you can't say that anymore. If you go through trial and you win, and that statement is found to be defamatory, the court can enter a permanent injunction saying, you can't say this anymore because it's defamatory. But short of that, the courts won't do that. But the harm to your reputation, it never really goes away, but it's also hard to calculate. And that's why it's so important that you reserve these kind of lawsuits. Unless you have hundreds of thousands of dollars to spend with no concern for outcome, then in that case, by all means, this is your man. Call him. He would be very interested to speak with you. But that being said, most people don't have that situation. Most people don't want to do that. Unless the consequences are really high, you don't want to do that for the same reason that injured people don't want to file lawsuits. They're not looking for an excuse to sue somebody or sue the insurance company. They had grievous injuries, and this is the only way to fix it.
Yeah, you know, one thing that really struck me, and I like this, is in Europe there's a right to be forgotten statute, which is a statute that says if Google, Yelp, if I don't want to be talked about, I have a right to contact Google and say take down everything that pertains to me, and they're obligated to. And you know, this is getting into another statute, but the Communications Decency Act gives protection, and I think a lot of people are very surprised to find out that you can't necessarily sue Yelp for a negative review. You can only sue the person who posted the review. And the theory behind that is that Congress didn't want to stymie free speech on the internet, and I don't think they anticipated there were going to be companies like Yelp, which basically makes its money off of reviews. Reviews. They've even been accused of nefarious conduct, like contacting restaurants and say, you really want to advertise on us and the implicit suggestion is that we can make some of these negative reviews go away. That's what some people have argued. So that's kind of an interesting thing, but what do you think about this right to be forgotten law, and would that be something that would be good here in the United States?
That's been around for a while. I think that what happens is a lot of these U.S. companies have avoided that kind of regulation just by being responsible actors. I've had a number of people in the past where I've sent letters to these services that gather information, scrape it, and put it online, and I know that they have no obligation to take this down, and I know full well that they're protected by Section 230, and I acknowledge that at the beginning of my demand to them, saying, I know you have no obligation to do this whatsoever. I know that we have no grounds to demand this, but
we're asking you to do the right thing.
Yeah, well, here are the facts and circumstances that you have no reason to know that are very important to my client. We ask respectfully that in light of their safety, their security, it could be somebody that is trying to escape a bad marriage, or somebody who is trying to change their name and avoid something because they were abused badly or something like that. You just ask, you have no legal obligation to do this, but if you could take this down, it would be very much appreciated. And you make a moral case. Has no legal basis whatsoever, but it tends to work. So there's some of that, but a lot of these companies tend to be responsible actors, so they get to avoid this kind of change to Section 230 that you're talking about, and the need for any kind of rubric for a right to be forgotten in the U.S. I don't know how that would even work here, honestly. The way it works in the EU is that if something is no longer newsworthy and it's old enough, so if you're the most notorious mass murderer in France, you're not going to get that forgotten. But if it's something where you had a youthful indiscretion and it wasn't newsworthy, you could purge it off of Google.
A DUI when you were 18 and now you're in your 50s or something.
Something like that, or even sooner than that, in your 30s, if it's no longer relevant. I don't know the contours of that. It's been refined by some decisional authority, but looking to the EU is a difficult comparison to make, because going back to Microsoft, which it's shocking now to realize how old I am, that there's people who don't remember any of that, and I'm probably going to be heard by people who were born after that all happened. The EU has always taken a very skeptical view of the United States technology companies, whether it's Microsoft, whether it's Facebook or Snapchat, and they're routinely getting fined or penalized for anti-competitive, or what the EU considers to be anti-competitive behavior. So I understand, and I don't think it's a bad idea. I think that with responsible action and people listening to their gut rather than what the maximum extent of what the law allows them to do, will avoid that problem in the United States. But it's a completely different mindset.
But you were telling me about a recent Supreme Court decision where Justice Thomas, I don't know if it was in a dissent or is it in the majority opinion, he offered some view that was kind of starting to chip away a little bit at this idea of the CDA having some of these, was it the anti-SLAPP issue?
I don't think it was the anti-SLAPP issue. I know Thomas has expressed dissent recently for the idea of New York Times versus Sullivan.
That's right.
Well, which was what we were talking about with the public figure. The actual malice standard. Backtracking a little bit, we're talking about the president having to prove that the person knew the statement was false. That goes back to a 1960 decision called New York Times versus Sullivan. And that established that somebody who's a public official and is an officer of government, they have to meet a higher standard to prevail on a defamation action. And recently, I don't remember the exact case, but I do know exactly what you're talking about. Justice Thomas raised the question in his dissent, why are we treating this as sacrosanct? Like, should we ever go back and evaluate this? This is an old decision. Maybe times have changed. And why are we ensconcing this and treating it as something that we can never go back and revise? So there is some appetite to revisit that, but I think the major impact of that is just the fact that somebody said it in the first place, rather than having to go back and do it. And the Supreme Court wields a lot of power. If you know that that's how one justice is thinking, these large media companies like the New York Times, like Facebook, like Google, the Washington Post, which is basically an arm of Amazon at this point, they look at this and they can read the tea leaves and say, look, we have this protection, but we need to bear in mind in the future that if we keep pushing, due to the law of large numbers, there will be litigation where we get to have this brought front and center and have to potentially deal with some uncomfortable consequences. It might not happen now, it might not happen in 2 years, but over the span of decades, when you're talking about tens or hundreds of millions of dollars, it's something that makes people very cautious.
So segueing to another topic, President Trump, he has introduced a new, I think, term in the American lexicon, fake news. And I think that concept resonates with a lot of people on whatever end of the political spectrum they're on. Liberals will say, what they see on Fox is fake news. Conservatives will say what they see on CNN is fake news. And then there's a lot of outliers. There's all kinds of radio shows and podcasts and programs that appeal to a variety of people of a variety of political stripes. And I know recently there was a successful defamation action against a book that was written about trying to argue that Sandy Hook was essentially just a made-up event. It was fake. And then there was also, some allegations that these people who, the Pulse nightclub was a manufactured event. The students at Stone Mary Hill in Florida the shooting took place, that those were actors. And so it seems like we're at a weird cultural place where people, people believe what they want to believe, and we're becoming more polarized. I'm all about free speech, but maybe this is beyond the scope of just a lawyer question. Where are we going?
It's a big cultural shift that I think is solved by less technology, not more.
Yeah.
You didn't have this happen when you had to talk to your neighbors face to face at the grocery store or something like that.
Those are like the normal times.
Oh yeah. Well, I don't know if you're going to get them back necessarily, but unless you want to live in a shack in the woods like a certain notorious American criminal, you can't really get away from it. But I think there's a big difference to it. People don't have skin in the game. You don't see people face to face. It deteriorates social interactions. I've met more awkward teenagers coming to ask me for advice than I can care to remember, just saying, well, have you tried this? Have you tried talking to the person face to face? And that solves a lot of it, from business disputes onward, and people just prefer to text. It gives rise to a certain keyboard warrior culture, to that point where nobody's talking. Yeah, you have these echo chambers. You have the right, the red team, the left, and the blue team, and they don't talk. They talk about how horrible the other side is, but they don't actually get together. And if you understand what the other person is saying, you can respond to it and concede. Bernie Sanders has good points. Donald Trump has good points. They're all coming from a place of good faith. They just have very different ideas of what's going to be best for the average American. But people don't want to have that dialogue. It's just, if you're on this side, you're irredeemable. You're a socialist or you're a racist, and you can label somebody and discount their opinion on that, and not have to be put in the position to concede you've got a point. I should listen to you. So to that end, I don't think the law is going to fix it. Suing people isn't going to fix it. I think it's this weird cultural thing. To the extent the law is going to fix it, I think that Senator Hawley is talking about making amendments to Section 230. Because to your point earlier about how the New York Times would have an editor that would review something before it got published, by law, you really can't have that editorial function. To be immune under Section 230, you just have to publish, and then if somebody complains to you, you have an exception for good faith filtering efforts. Where, okay, if somebody complains to you and you're getting rid of spam, or you're getting rid of something that's unlawful or vile or offensive, then you're fine. You don't diminish that. But if you're selecting what gets published, or if you're amending it, then you potentially lose that protection. I know that there's a push to amend that law. I don't know how serious it is, but just the fact that somebody's saying it is pretty significant, when previously that was completely off the table. So that'll be interesting to watch. But I think the only thing that you can really do there is to kind of attack these services and degrade them through the enforcement of antitrust, so that people think about Facebook as a social company, but they don't know that they were doing VR, they're doing AI, they're doing government contracting. They should all be different places. That's my opinion. And if you want to improve social interaction, the idea is that not having this kind of monolithic presence that's everywhere and you have multiple apps. I mean, if you were to pull out your phone, I don't know how big of a social media guy you are. I'm personally not, but if you have Snapchat and Facebook and Instagram, you're spending all your time on that. If you could eliminate some of those, I think face-to-face interactions and cohesion would improve.
That's a great point. That's a really good point.
It's a good point to end on.
That's
Get off social media.
a good point to end on. Get a life, people. Get off Facebook. Get off the social media. Get to know your neighbor. Go next door. Yeah. Try to borrow some sugar. Just strike up a conversation. Be a friendly human being. And you don't need to offer your opinion on every single business out there. You know, recognize that there are a lot of small business owners that are just trying to make a living, and maybe service is not perfect. And, you know, just maybe offer a better criticism. People are so angry, it seems.
Everyone's trying.
Nobody's
Nobody's trying to make your experience bad. It's just assume that everyone's operating in good faith, and if you're unhappy with it, if you can't say something nice about it, like, I understand you have a bad day, but can you do X? Try to do better next time. It's unfortunate, but everyone's out there. Just because you had a bad day doesn't mean that everyone else should suffer, and they might be having a terrible day as well. You have no idea what somebody else is going through.
That's so true. Jay, thank you so much for coming on today. This has really been incredibly informative. If people want to find you, let's say somebody out there is watching the show, a restaurant owner, a business owner, an individual, and they say, hey, I want to hire that guy. Where would they go?
Call Holland & Hart. I don't know the number by heart yet. I just started there, but I'm looking forward to it. I think it's an excellent firm with very talented attorneys, and I'm very happy to be joining them.
Thank you so much, Jay.
Thank you very much. It's a pleasure to meet you.
Folks, till next time, thank you for joining us on the Paul Padda Podcast.